Right now, the idea of deliberately eating rocks sounds like something out of a bizarre survival horror scenario, definitely not a normal, intentional part of anyone's regular diet. Yet there's a persistent claim floating around that ancient humans and even some animals today actually did eat rocks, or at least something very close to it, on purpose. So is this actually true? Did ancient humans really eat rocks? And if so, why on earth would anyone deliberately consume something so seemingly indigestible and potentially dangerous? Let's dig into this properly, because the honest answer involves some truly fascinating biology, a specific, well documented practice worth carefully distinguishing from popular misconception, and a behavior that turns out to be considerably more widespread across the animal kingdom than most people probably realize. Let's start with the most important clarification worth establishing directly up front because it shapes how to properly understand everything else in this topic. When researchers and historians discuss ancient humans eating rocks, they're generally not describing people randomly biting into large stones or swallowing sharp gravel for no particular reason. The actual, well documented practice involves something more specific: geophagy, the deliberate consumption of soil, clay, or other fine mineral rich earth materials, a practice documented across numerous ancient and even some modern human cultures, along with a wide range of different animal species. This is a seriously different, more specific practice compared to simply eating random large rocks in any casual, undirected sense. And understanding this distinction matters quite a bit for properly evaluating the actual historical and scientific evidence involved. Let's talk about why ancient humans and various other cultures throughout history actually practiced geophagy, because there turn out to be several distinct, scientifically plausible explanations worth exploring rather than just one single, simple reason. Various types of clay and mineral-rich earth contain meaningful concentrations of specific minerals, including iron, calcium, and various other trace minerals that play important roles in human health and nutrition. In populations facing chronic dietary mineral deficiencies, deliberately consuming small quantities of specific mineral-rich clay or earth could have provided a genuine, meaningful nutritional supplement, helping address gaps in an otherwise limited or seasonally restricted diet, particularly in regions or historical periods where reliable access to a fully varied, nutritionally complete diet wasn't always consistently available. This detail is worth sitting with directly, because it means geophagy, rather than representing some kind of bizarre, purely irrational behavior, may have actually served a genuine practical nutritional function for at least some ancient populations, discovered and refined through the same kind of accumulated trial and error and careful generational observation already explored extensively regarding numerous other ancient practical knowledge topics throughout human history. Let's talk about another significant, well-documented explanation for geophagy too, because this represents an equally important, scientifically supported dimension of this broader practice worth exploring specifically. Certain types of clay possess genuine, measurable properties that help absorb and neutralize specific toxins and harmful compounds, including certain plant-based toxins and even some types of harmful bacteria and their associated toxic byproducts. This detail becomes particularly significant and relevant when you consider that various ancient and traditional cultures documented practicing geophagy often did so specifically alongside consuming certain wild plants known to contain natural toxins or compounds that would otherwise cause significant digestive distress if eaten entirely on their own. Consuming clay alongside these specific plants may have helped bind and effectively neutralize some of these natural plant toxins, allowing these particular plant foods to be more safely incorporated into the overall diet than would otherwise have been possible without this specific detoxifying practice. This represents a remarkably sophisticated, practically valuable piece of ancient applied knowledge, discovered entirely through careful trial and error and accumulated observation across many generations, long before anyone had any scientific chemical understanding of exactly why certain clays possessed this particular toxin-binding property in the first place. It's another compelling example of the broader pattern already explored extensively throughout other topics regarding ancient practical knowledge. Actually effective techniques discovered and refined purely through patient observation and experimentation, entirely independent of any formal theoretical understanding explaining exactly why that specific technique actually worked. Let's talk about pregnancy and geophagy specifically too, because this connects to an interesting, frequently documented pattern worth exploring in more depth. Geophagy has been documented as occurring notably more frequently among pregnant women across numerous different cultures and historical periods, a pattern that's led researchers to propose several possible explanations worth considering directly. Pregnancy significantly increases a woman's specific mineral requirements, particularly for iron and calcium, meaning the increased geophagy sometimes observed during pregnancy may represent an instinctive, physiologically driven response to really increased mineral needs during this specific, particularly demanding period of a woman's reproductive life. Some researchers have also proposed that geophagy during pregnancy specifically might serve a protective function against certain toxins or pathogens, potentially helping protect a particularly vulnerable developing fetus during this especially critical developmental period. Let's talk about how this same basic behavior shows up extensively across the broader animal kingdom, too, because this represents an important, significantly compelling piece of comparative evidence worth exploring specifically, reinforcing that this isn't some kind of uniquely human behavioral quirk isolated to our own species alone. Numerous animal species, including various primates, elephants, and many bird species, have been extensively documented deliberately consuming soil, clay, or specific mineral deposits, generally for reasons closely paralleling the explanations already discussed regarding human geophagy specifically, addressing mineral deficiencies and helping neutralize dietary toxins encountered through their typical diet. Parrots in various regions, for instance, have been extensively documented visiting specific clay licks, consuming clay from these particular mineral-rich deposits specifically to help neutralize toxins present in certain seeds and unripe fruits that otherwise make up a significant, regular part of their typical natural diet. This cross-species pattern is worth appreciating specifically because it strongly reinforces the underlying biological logic already discussed throughout this topic. If geophagy purely reflected some kind of irrational, biologically meaningless human cultural quirk, you wouldn't necessarily expect to see the same basic underlying behavior showing up so extensively and independently across such a truly wide range of completely unrelated animal species, each evolving this behavior entirely independently in response to comparable underlying nutritional and toxin-related pressures within their own respective, often very different diets and environments. Let's talk about specific, well-documented ancient sites and cultures where geophagy has been particularly extensively studied, because grounding this discussion in concrete examples helps move beyond general explanation into truly specific, well-researched historical evidence. Certain regions of ancient and traditional Africa show particularly extensive, well-documented geophagy traditions with specific clay deposits, sometimes referred to using regional terms for edible clay, having been actively traded and consumed across considerable distances for many centuries, suggesting a seriously established, economically significant practice rather than merely an occasional, incidental behavior. Similarly, various regions of Mesoamerica show archaeological and historical evidence of geophagy practices connected to specific ceremonial and dietary traditions, sometimes closely tied to the consumption of maize-based foods, where certain minerals present in consumed clay may have helped improve the nutritional availability of specific compounds present within maize itself, an interesting specific nutritional interaction that some modern researchers have investigated in more scientific detail. Let's talk about kaolin clay specifically, because it represents one of the most extensively documented and specifically studied types of edible clay worth exploring in more detail. Kaolin, a specific type of fine white clay, has a particularly long, well-documented history of both ancient and more recent consumption across numerous different cultures and historical periods, valued specifically for its relatively fine texture and its documented mineral and toxin-binding properties already discussed more generally earlier in this topic. Interestingly, certain compounds derived from kaolin clay were even incorporated into early versions of certain modern over-the-counter digestive medications, specifically designed to help treat diarrhea and other digestive complaints, representing a fascinating direct continuity between ancient traditional geophagy practice and considerably more recent pharmaceutical development, both relying on broadly the same fundamental toxin binding and digestive settling properties that traditional cultures had already identified and practically applied for many centuries before modern pharmaceutical science formally isolated and specifically incorporated those same properties into an official, clinically tested medical product. This detail is worth appreciating specifically because it represents a particularly clear, well documented example of traditional practical knowledge eventually receiving direct, formal scientific validation and even commercial pharmaceutical application, reinforcing the broader pattern already explored extensively throughout other topics regarding ancient practical wisdom, frequently anticipating and, in some specific cases, directly informing considerably later formal scientific understanding and development. By the way, if you want to go even deeper into the secret lives of ancient humans, I just launched a full course called The Secret Lives of Ancient Humans. 10 modules, 3+ hours of content covering everything we never talk about on YouTube. What they feared, how they communicated, what hunted them, and much more. Plus an exclusive PDF guide included. Link in the description. See you inside. Let's talk about the important distinction between traditional, culturally established geophagy and pica, a recognized clinical condition too, because this represents an important nuance worth addressing directly and honestly. Modern medicine recognizes pica as a diagnosable condition involving persistent, compulsive consumption of non-food items, sometimes including but not limited to soil or clay, that can occur independently of any genuine nutritional benefit and can sometimes indicate an underlying nutritional deficiency, developmental condition, or other specific health concern requiring appropriate medical attention and evaluation. It's worth drawing a clear, direct distinction between this specific clinical condition and the culturally established, generally more moderate and carefully knowledge-based traditional geophagy practices already discussed extensively throughout this topic. Since conflating these two remarkably different categories risks either inappropriately pathologizing legitimate traditional cultural practice, or conversely, inappropriately normalizing actually concerning compulsive behavior that might actually benefit from proper medical evaluation and appropriate care. This distinction matters for approaching this entire topic with appropriate nuance and accuracy, rather than treating every instance of soil or clay consumption as functionally identical, regardless of context, motivation, or actual quantity and frequency involved. Let's talk about how modern researchers actually study ancient geophagy practices too, because this represents an interesting methodological question worth addressing directly. Beyond the historical and anthropological documentation already discussed, researchers studying ancient geophagy specifically analyze the mineral composition of clay deposits found near ancient settlement sites, comparing these specific mineral profiles against the documented nutritional deficiencies common within that particular region and historical period, allowing researchers to build a more scientifically grounded case for exactly which specific nutritional or protective functions a given ancient population's documented clay consumption most likely actually served. This kind of detailed compositional analysis, combined with careful anthropological comparison to more recent, directly observable traditional geophagy practices, has allowed researchers to move considerably beyond purely speculative explanation toward an increasingly evidence-based, scientifically grounded understanding of this specific ancient practice. Let's talk about geophagy and specific dietary contexts too, because it's worth exploring how this practice frequently intersected with particular staple food traditions in interesting, specific ways. In various regions where a population's diet relied heavily on a single dominant staple crop, potentially creating specific predictable nutritional gaps if that particular staple didn't happen to provide a really complete, balanced nutritional profile on its own, geophagy sometimes served as a specific, culturally recognized dietary supplement precisely calibrated to help address whatever particular nutritional gap that specific staple-heavy diet tended to create. This detail adds an interesting layer of practical sophistication worth appreciating, suggesting that at least some traditional geophagy practices weren't simply generic, undifferentiated mineral supplementation, but rather represented a fairly specific, culturally refined dietary practice calibrated to address the particular nutritional needs and gaps most relevant to that specific population's own particular staple diet and broader nutritional circumstances. Let's talk about how this whole topic connects to broader themes already explored regarding ancient practical medical and nutritional knowledge, too, because it's worth drawing this explicit connection before wrapping up this discussion. Geophagy fits neatly alongside numerous other examples already discussed extensively throughout other topics regarding ancient humans developing significantly functional, practically valuable knowledge through patient, accumulated observation and trial and error, entirely independent of any formal theoretical or scientific understanding of the specific underlying biological or chemical mechanisms actually responsible for that practical knowledge's genuine effectiveness. This recurring pattern, showing up across topics as varied as ancient food preservation, ancient wound care, and now geophagy specifically, reveals something worth appreciating about ancient human ingenuity more broadly. An impressive, sophisticated capacity for developing meaningfully effective practical solutions to real biological and nutritional challenges, built entirely through careful, patient observation rather than formal theoretical understanding. A mode of discovery that, while less systematic than modern scientific method, nonetheless frequently arrived at truly valid, scientifically supportable practical conclusions. Let's talk about the archaeological and historical evidence specifically confirming ancient human geophagy too, because grounding this discussion in concrete evidence helps move beyond purely theoretical explanation alone. Various archaeological sites show evidence of specific clay deposits being deliberately, repeatedly accessed and utilized by ancient human populations, and historical and anthropological records from numerous different cultures across multiple continents specifically document geophagy as an established, culturally recognized practice, sometimes tied to specific religious or ceremonial significance, and sometimes practiced more casually as a routine, ordinary part of daily dietary practice, depending on the specific culture and historical period actually being examined. Let's talk about the real risks and potential dangers associated with geophagy too, because it's worth balancing out the practical benefits already discussed with an honest, direct acknowledgement that this practice wasn't without genuine risk, particularly depending heavily on the specific type of earth or clay actually being consumed. Not all soil or clay is safe to consume, and certain types can contain harmful levels of specific heavy metals, dangerous parasites, or other seriously harmful contaminants, meaning traditional geophagy practices generally involved considerable accumulated practical knowledge regarding specifically which particular clay deposits or soil types were considered safe and beneficial to consume, and which specific sources needed to be carefully avoided due to known risk. This detail reinforces an important point worth carrying through this entire discussion. Traditional geophagy wasn't simply random, undirected dirt consumption. It represented a carefully refined, culturally transmitted practice built on considerable accumulated practical knowledge regarding exactly which specific earth sources were remarkably safe and beneficial, and which specific sources carried meaningful risk and needed to be deliberately avoided. Let's talk about geophagy in the modern world too, because this represents an interesting, often overlooked detail worth including before wrapping up this discussion. Geophagy hasn't actually disappeared as a human practice, continuing to be documented in various forms across numerous cultures around the world today, sometimes tied to specific traditional or cultural practices, and sometimes occurring as a documented, clinically recognized symptom potentially associated with certain specific mineral deficiencies, or, in some clinical contexts, certain other underlying health conditions. This detail is worth including because it demonstrates that geophagy isn't purely some kind of distant, exclusively ancient historical curiosity. It represents an ongoing, actively studied area of human behavior and nutritional science, with modern researchers continuing to investigate exactly which specific underlying mechanisms, nutritional, protective, cultural, or some combination of all three, actually drive this behavior in different specific populations and contexts around the world today. Let's talk about geographic and environmental variation in geophagy practices too, because it's worth appreciating how this behavior manifested differently depending on locally available soil and clay types, echoing a pattern of environmentally driven variation already explored extensively regarding numerous other ancient practical technologies and behaviors throughout this broader series. Populations living near naturally occurring, mineral-rich clay deposits with favorable properties naturally had more consistent, reliable access to suitable material for this practice. While populations in regions without convenient access to appropriate clay sources may have relied more heavily on trade networks specifically established to acquire particularly valued mineral rich clay from more distant sources, echoing similar trade dynamics already discussed regarding other historically valuable materials like salt and gold. This variation reinforces an important point worth carrying through this entire discussion. Geophagy wasn't a single, uniform practice identical everywhere it occurred. It represented a flexible, locally adapted practice, shaped by whatever specific clay and soil resources happened to be available within a given region, and refined over generations into whatever specific form best suited that particular population's own local environment and nutritional circumstances. Let's zoom out and pull all of these different threads together, because the full accurate answer to whether ancient humans really ate rocks turns out to be a qualified yes. Once you properly understand and account for the important distinction already established at the very beginning of this discussion, ancient humans didn't randomly consume large indigestible rocks or sharp gravel in any casual, undirected sense, but the deliberate, culturally established practice of consuming specific mineral-rich clay and earth, geophagy, was actually widespread across numerous ancient and traditional human cultures throughout history, likely serving several real, scientifically plausible, practical functions, addressing specific dietary mineral deficiencies, helping neutralize certain natural plant toxins, and potentially providing additional protective benefit during the especially demanding, vulnerable period of pregnancy specifically. This same basic underlying behavioral pattern shows up extensively and independently across a really wide range of different animal species as well, further reinforcing the underlying biological logic and practical value of this specific behavior, rather than representing some kind of uniquely strange, biologically meaningless human cultural quirk. So the next time you encounter the claim that ancient humans ate rocks, it's worth appreciating the more precise, considerably more scientifically interesting reality actually hiding behind that admittedly catchy, oversimplified popular framing. Ancient humans were engaging in a significantly sophisticated, carefully refined dietary practice. Rather than randomly chewing on stones, developed and passed down through generations of careful observation, one that modern nutritional science has increasingly come to recognize as reflecting real, legitimate biological logic rather than representing some kind of strange, irrational ancient behavioral curiosity worth casually dismissing without any further, more careful examination, which leaves an interesting thought worth sitting with. If something as seemingly bizarre and irrational as eating dirt actually turns out to reflect sophisticated, biologically grounded practical wisdom, once you properly examine the full scientific context behind it, what other seemingly strange or inexplicable ancient practices, frequently dismissed today as primitive superstition or irrational behavior, might actually be hiding a similarly sophisticated, scientifically valid practical logic that we simply haven't yet taken the time to properly, carefully investigate and understand, waiting quietly for modern science to eventually catch up and confirm what generations of careful, patient observation had already worked out through nothing more than trial, error, and the accumulated wisdom passed down from one generation to the next.